Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Mohammed, for your very clear presentation of a very tough issue, the agriculture debates and between the EU and the US and this particular point of the geographical indication. I guess that it will, for a quick question and answer session later on, give some food for discussion, if I may. So thank you so much. And I would like now, I have the pleasure now to introduce our panelists. Because having heard now two presentations on the global dimensions of the TTIP and so between the US and the EU, the idea was now to have panelists who will talk from the perspective of either specific topics. And I would like to welcome, with the reverse order now, I would like to start introducing Mark Tyner, who is a senior professional staff member of the Senator Mary Landrieu's staff as a chair of the U.S. Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So welcome, Mr. Mark Tyner. Who will also later on talk to us during the lunch about the energy, specifically energy dimensions. I would like also to welcome, as a panelist from Louisiana who will offer us a Louisiana perspective on the trade or economic experience in their different economic and industrial activities about EU-Louisiana business relations. I would like to welcome Dr. Joseph Weinberg, Assistant Professor in Political Science, International Development and International Affairs at the University of Southern Mississippi. Welcome. And next to him is, I would like to welcome Professor Patrick Hugg from the Loyola University School of Law here in New Orleans. Welcome, Professor, and thank you for participating to this panel. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Mr. John Hyatt, Vice President of the Irwin Brown Company. I would like to suggest, having presented now and introduced the panelists, so we follow the order that was foreseen for the discussion. If I may then give the floor, maybe first to the moderator. Of course, I didn't introduce, sorry for that. York Forsyth from the World Trade Center, who will be the moderator of this panel discussion right now. So, Mr. Forsyth, I give you the floor, and thank you for.
How you doing, everybody? We can just go ahead and get started. If each one of you guys want to give a comment, we can start with Mr. Tyner on the end.
Can everybody hear me? We're live. So first of all, thank you for organizing Dominic and the World Trade Center and your staff. It's a tremendous honor to be here and to be a part of the panel, such an esteemed panel, and Senator Landrieu certainly sends her best regards to a crowd that is interested and engaged in and working on international trade issues in New Orleans. For a long time, I worked for Senator Landrieu in two different iterations. First, for 10 years, I worked in Shreveport, and then later in Lake Charles, and then in Washington, and ultimately ended up as her foreign affairs advisor and national security advisor. And after a stint in private practice, have come back to work for Senator Landrieu on the Energy Committee. And I think that there is considerable interest at this point in the Energy Committee's assignments, their jurisdictions, and what they are doing in the world of energy at the moment. And Louisiana happens to sit at the center of world energy developments at the moment. And as we talk about what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and other geopolitical hotspots, Louisiana happens to be linked to many of those particular hotspots. You might think that in the Gulf of Mexico that we might be so far away from those things that we might not have linked to EU trade, but as it turns out, we are a very critical player in the global economy. And over again in the last couple of months since Senator Landrieu took her chairmanship, it's become apparent that that role on the Energy Committee and Louisiana's place in the world of energy is a very important one. So Adeline, we are very excited to have you here for the first time in Louisiana. As a native Louisianian, I always love having folks that are not from here to come and get a chance to taste the cuisine and understand the culture of Louisiana that is more distinct than any other cultural milieu in the rest of the United States. And I think, Monsieur Consul, it is a tremendous opportunity as we talk about global energy markets. France, I think that we have a number of businesses that we are engaged in with France. I see the Consul General of the Netherlands. We obviously, since Katrina, have had a number of issues with the Netherlands that we seek your counsel and advice and expertise on. And then, of course, you mentioned the Italian-American relationship, and there are a number of technological things that the Italians are doing as it relates to energy issues. Some of the foreign direct investment, let's touch on that for 1 second. And by the way, do you want to have everybody say a couple of opening words? How did you want to
If we could
navigate that?
Probably about 5 minutes apiece. You got a few more minutes.
Okay. I didn't want to hog the time just yet. But there are a number of countries globally that are involved in the energy sector in Louisiana. At some estimates, there are $100 billion worth of foreign direct investment going into energy projects in Louisiana alone. And there is a terrific amount of enthusiasm as it relates to all of the things that are happening in the energy sector. And to be at the tip of the spear, to be able to be in a discussion on a day that we're celebrating the EU-American relationship, particularly focused in Louisiana, we are very fortunate to be a part of that. And I had a discussion this morning with a member of the staff of GNO Inc., and I think that our approach to internationalism in New Orleans is a unique one. Louisiana, because of its cultural heritage, has unique characteristics that no other state has. Our ability and focus on bilingualism is extremely important. The Codafil program has been important in shaping many of our French speakers for a long time, and as it relates to a lot of trade opportunities, I think those kinds of things, an outward approach to the world, not just an inward approach to the world, is going to be very important as the energy sector matures. Just last week, we were having discussions about Russian sanctions. So even though I may focus on an issue like international energy issues in Latin America, I would be involved on a Russian sanctions issue because it affects a lot of multinational companies that do business in Louisiana that have operations in the Gulf of Mexico. There are layers upon layers of issues as it relates to energy, and many of them relate to the export, as we have now come to realize the possibility of exporting energy is a long time. We never would have thought that we were in a position to export energy at this point, and now we're re-examining the idea that we could be potentially doing that because we have found an abundance of energy, particularly natural gas, and the energy revolutions that's taking place here, and how that is going to affect global markets, and it already is having an impact, and how do we continue that renaissance. And as the Energy Committee is taking a look at all of these issues, your input and the advance of these discussions, and certainly with our partners and allies in the EU, is a critical one. So we greatly appreciate the World Trade Center convening this conversation. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Tyner. Dr. Weinberg?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be in front of everybody here. I'm not a native golfer of any kind. I'm from North Carolina, but thank you for having me at any rate. Broadly speaking, a professor of international relations. I used to work in Washington, D.C. As an agriculture assistant to a U.S. congressman. Worked on the tobacco settlement, which was big, of course, for us in North Carolina, and the Farm Bill, 2 Farm Bills ago. And I just wanted to bring it back to agriculture a little bit. I know that we'll have plenty of time to talk about energy, which is, of course, very interesting to the state and a lot of people in here. It's come up a few times that the only thing that stands between us and this great agreement is figuring out agriculture. And I mentioned to somebody earlier, the only thing standing between me and being a millionaire is finding $1 million somewhere. It's not a minor thing. Dr. Mohammed laid out a lot of the problems, and a lot of them are somewhat humorous. And so I had some of his stories and some funnier ones, equally as funny. Different regions and that sort of thing, but the truth of it is, if it's such a good deal, and if you look at all the numbers, if it's such a good deal and it makes so much economic sense, why isn't it happened yet? And you'll forgive me, I've been burned before by these promises of this deal going through, when it was called TAFTA in the 90s and when it was called various other things, and there would be a lot of benefits. There would be a lot of benefits for the United States, but there'd be a lot of drawbacks for people too. The economic side, I think, makes perfect sense. It's sometimes confusing for the economists why governments would choose a policy that's so inefficient and makes so little sense. Why are we charging them twice to come across the border? Why do we have tariffs on these things at all? Why do we have 2 different sets of qualitative restrictions? If it's safe enough to drive in the United States, surely it's safe enough to drive in Germany, things like that. The answer broadly is that it's purely political reasons. It makes economic sense. The economic deal is not hard to figure out. It's math. The political one is quite a bit harder. I've sort of listed these problems in order of chance that it's going to work out. We could have this deal without agriculture. I don't think it'll be as comprehensive as a lot of people want it to be, but some of the issues, we talked about the sanitary measures for our beef, for our poultry in particular. Is the way that we treat poultry unsafe? Bleach, this sort of stuff. The science, we mentioned the European scientists. They come to different conclusions than American scientists. If we found some different European scientists, I'm sure they could come to the right conclusion. The question is not, is it safe? Are we arguing scientific points? The question is, if poultry treated with bleach is unsafe, then French poultry farmers sell more poultry. So go find me a scientist that says it's not safe. And they're not alone. We do the exact same thing. All right? Sugar, I know, is a touchy subject for some people in this room, and the protection that Louisiana sugar farmers get. Is sugar cane better or worse than sugar beet sugar? Scientists tell me that they're identical, 0.005% difference, that you can't taste the difference between sugar made from sugar cane, sugar made from sugar beet. I say sugar beets are un-American and they taste terrible. And we can discriminate against we can't discriminate against like products. It's international law. If we can determine that they're not alike, they're qualitatively different, now we can do a trade restriction. All right, so if sugar cane is different, let's go ahead and keep our tariffs on sugar cane. You sell it, but you have to put sugar beet may taste worse than sugar cane on the label. All right? So we all play these games. The Europeans and the Americans have been playing this game for a long time. The WTO has been was able to negotiate agriculture trade in 1994 because of an agreement between the EU and the US. It was very difficult, the EC, I suppose, at the time, for a gentleman named Ray McSherry from the EU to negotiate. And it finally went through at the Blair House, so we were allowed to start talking about agriculture. We started a new round of trade in 1999, and it's still going on. No agreement on agriculture, 15 years, okay? We feel very differently in the two countries about what agriculture is. It's not just a sector. We can't say agriculture here, cars here, whatever there. We're talking about farmers, rural America, life, big stuff. You can't take that out and just call it numbers. They feel more like that in the European Union. Farmers are part of the European Union itself. Farmers are stewards of the land, environmental policy, farm policy. It's all tied together. You can't cut them loose. Genetically modified organisms. Are they dangerous? Depends on the scientist you ask. If you get a chance, go to the Czech Republic, a town called Brno. There's a good brewery, the Staro Brno Brewery, and right next door is Gregor Mendel's home, where he did his experiments on peas, genetically modifying them. I like to throw that at the Europeans. They like to throw plenty of things back at me, and I think it's fine. Real quickly on the geographical indications. This gets us into another tricky area of intellectual property. I think it's funny. The Parmesan cheese, we'll call it white cheese and buy it for $2 and pour it on our spaghetti. That's fine, which we probably shouldn't even call spaghetti. But we don't want them to sell, if you look at the problems we have with the Chinese, we don't want them to sell something brown in a bottle and call it Jack Daniels. At what point are we talking about taking money off of somebody's table? If you're going to say it's the same thing, you're going to sell it for the same, but I work hard. Of course, they feel differently about food than we do. Not in New Orleans, but in the rest of this country. If you go to Golden Corral, they don't ask you where the food came from. You're just eating it. At any rate, it's a very big deal. There's a lot of things to be gained here, mostly through the ports. Enhanced exports, but when you think about if it's all so good, why hasn't it happened? It's because Senator Landrieu and everyone else has to go home and tell their sugar farmers that they voted for it. All right, and they have to say, look at all the gains that big companies made. By the way, you're out of business. All right, so that's always the problem with trade politics. In the EU, it's doubled. I think we're going to hear a little bit about the recent elections. If you're Eurosceptic, as apparently they are, this recent round of elections is not a mandate for more EU. Trade agreement and agriculture are the biggest EU things you could be. So it's like our version of being afraid of big government. This is the biggest government you can get. All right? The geographical indications, it means Italy's mad, it means France is mad. All right? France and Germany, by the way, are where we're going to get our new inferior sugar from. It means they're mad. They're not going to sign it. The Commission obviously gets to do that. It's a whole nother ball of wax. I think we're fine with it. We can figure out a way to help our farmers in a way that complies with the rules. I don't know that they can, but I'm glad that we're all working on it together. How about that? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Dr. Weinberg. Professor Hug?
May I show slides at this point, or should we do it? Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to give a lecture of 75 minutes length, but I don't think that this is going to happen right now. Nonetheless, I have a frightening bit of news, thank you, to give you, and that has to do with the elections that took place over the weekend some 10 days ago in Europe. The European Parliament, every member stood for election under the 7 different political flags, and the results were pretty harrowing. Before I go further, I must say thank you for the Consular Corps, Alliance Française, the students, and everyone here. At our law school, we are very focused on internationalism. Alliance Française comes into our law school building and offers 3 levels of French instruction. We believe you can't pretend to practice international law without having at least a second language, and maybe go for more. So with that said, thank you all for being here. And now back to the frightening tale of the European elections. These were predicted, but people were shocked at how they turned out. There we go. From the Financial Times to the BBC, The Economist, almost everybody adopted the Prime Minister of France's term, calling it a political earthquake. The scary thing about this political earthquake is that it's going to reshape politics, and we know that politics affects the ability of the European Union to offer trade concessions and to enter into a trade agreement such as the TTIP. After this kind of frightening election, and I'll elaborate exactly why it's frightening, we'll see that the ability of the political leaders in Europe has been seriously restrained or diminished, lessening the chances for a broader TTIP agreement, and certainly delaying the negotiations somewhat. We understand politics in the United States and how it affects trade agreements. Well, it's maybe even worse in Europe. The European Union is an unusual polity in which much of their sovereignty has in fact been pooled in a semi-federal arrangement. And yet the member state national leaders, especially in this era, maintain control of the direction of the EU. And over the next 6 months, they're going to appoint the new president of the civil service, of the commission, which I'd love to hear any comments from there. I'm an outsider. I go a lot and I teach a lot in this area, but when you don't live there, you're still a pretender. So I offer these as my thoughts, and I ask for input from those who are much more knowledgeable. But regardless, the president of the commission has to be agreed upon by the national leaders and this new parliament. The president of the European Council has to be agreed upon. All of the commissioners, in particular the commissioner in charge of trade, has to be agreed upon. The High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security has to be agreed upon. All of this to say the general EU administration must be agreed upon in the next 6 months and following this frightening earthquake event. It's a dodgy situation, to say the least. It's not what we would favor. In France, Marine Le Pen, I Googled it. I tell my students there's no excuse not to pronounce people's names correctly. And her party, the Front National, can be termed xenophobic, anti-immigration, and they were the winners of the European Parliament election in France, getting 25% of the vote. This is a pretty strong right-wing group. I think this is fair to say. It's a political decision, I guess. But in multi-party elections, you'll notice that 25% of the vote, they're the winners. No one else got 25%. Okay? So for the first time in a long time, we don't have the usual center-left, center-right leaders in the elections. We've got a pretty radical party. In the United Kingdom, even stronger, the United Kingdom Independence Party, led by Nigel Farage, who's a really funny guy and a great speaker, but he's entirely anti-EU. He refuses to align with Le Pen, which is probably a good thing, but it sends to the Parliament many seats that are expressly anti-European. How can you be in the European Parliament constructively if you're anti-European?
British.
You're British, thank you. So it's setting up a difficult landscape. Some 140 newly elected parliamentarians, MEPs as they call them, out of 751, 140 are anti-EU or at least Eurosceptical, and we'll see exactly these figures in just a second. In Greece, there's no surprise here. Greece was hit terribly hard by EU-mandated austerity measures. They have suffered enormously. The reasons are a topic for another day, but the far-left Syriza party of Cyprus got 26.6% of the vote. So this is, again, another country, a member state of the EU, in which the traditional parties did not win, but rather an extremist party. We don't need to see that. The percentage of vote won by populist parties, well, it's there plain to see. This parliament is going to be oriented in a way that frightens your European politicians. As Mr. Tyner will tell us, politicians cannot ignore great political surges, and this is what we're seeing in Europe. Unfortunately, this will in many ways strongly influence the composition of the Parliament and many of the EU leadership roles, and even more importantly, it's going to in some ways limit the ability of the EU member state national leaders in what they can advocate in trade agreements and in further integration efforts at the EU level. I don't think we have time to analyze the various parties. Suffice it to say that you can see that the heavy anti-EU parties have gone from 33 to over 100, and this is just clearly affecting the political environment, and it's going to last, or at least the composition of the administration of the EU is going to last for 5 years. Okay. If you look to the right, the Lib Dems are urging strong reform, and they are a coalition party often in many countries and even in the European Parliament. They're strongly critical of the present EU. That's quite the trend, to be anti-Brussels. Radical anti-EU, 102 by this graph. Extreme, 7, and then other, 25. So we know the TTIP is part of it. Many of the anti-everything people tend to be against globalization. They tend to be against corporations. They tend to be against the United States. And so we've seen protests all over Europe. Here we have a zombie walk by the Pirate Party. The Pirate Party has placed people in the Bundestag. So, I mean, it's a real, for real party. And they are against the TTIP. In Brussels last Thursday, 240, according to the Euractiv, they said, reported that 240 protesters were arrested, water cannon were out. This is not a happy environment for Angela Merkel and David Cameron to travel to Brussels and make decisions about who's going to be the next president of the Commission and then get it passed or consented to by the European Parliament. So that's where we are. We're facing a petulant EU Parliament with timid national leaders who are running, I think it's fair to say, the European Union at this time. And of course, we have our own cautious US politicians because of our elections. I think we're facing some elections here this year and in 2 years, big elections. The media coverage of this coming senatorial and congressional election is just ubiquitous, right? Anyway, my thesis, help me with it. I appreciate your input. I must learn. I think we will get a modest TTIP, although I'm not sure Dr. Weinberg is with me on that. We have to discuss that. And I think that a modest TTIP, I'm a strategic free trader. I still see benefits, economic gains, and I'm in favor of it. And I think even a modest TTIP will generate other advancements around the world with other free trade agreements. And overall, those of us who teach and study in this area know liberalization of trade can be an uneven, slow process, but in general, it promotes economic growth and prosperity. And thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Hyatt?
Well, a little more optimistic view. As a freight forwarder customs broker, I'm just looking at the base, Louisiana, the current position, Louisiana, regarding the EU. And I'm looking at basically investments we have so far. You've got greenfield and facility enhancements all over the state. BASF out of Germany's building a formic acid plant they just broke ground on. SNF out of France is building a $362 million facility in Plaquemine. Bentler out of Austria is building a $900 million hot rolling mill in Cato, Louisiana. Drax from the UK is building a terminal in Gloucester, Port Allen, taking wood chips out of Gloucester to basically warm the homes of Great Britain. Cato Natty out of Belgium is building a $150 million logistics facility in Baton Rouge to move chemicals into Europe. So there are a lot of things going on that could benefit from a more liberal trading regime with the EU. One thing that's rather interesting, Dr. Mohammed had mentioned as far as the ag sector, of course, we're very good in ag as far as the transportation end of it, and it's even more efficient now. There's a facility being built in Lake Charles, Louisiana, called IFG Port Holdings, a $59.5 million export grain terminal, which would handle rice, wheat, corn, soybeans, dried distiller's grain, arriving from points all around the United States. And it's capable of loading both bulk cargoes and containers, and would be very efficient to get cargoes on a cost-effective basis to other parts of the world, particularly the EU. One other point I just wanted to touch on was the whole reason for these various developments is basically the spill-off from the natural gas boom. Natural gas is sort of like flour that a baker uses. It can be used to make any sorts of things. So, and that's really what is encouraging this. Of course, we do have some one step forward, two steps back. I think there was a resolution passed in the Louisiana legislature poo-pooing the idea of Eurochem Moscow building a facility here in Louisiana. I hadn't heard the last session whether that resolution came through or not, but I suspect that's some pushback from what Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine. One final thing, just on the whole business with natural gas and LNG. There was a visit several months ago from the port of Klaipėda, Lithuania, and interestingly enough, we discussed that they were building an import terminal for receiving LNG shipments, basically part of the whole Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland. And interestingly enough, in a meeting we had with Congressman Bustani several weeks ago, Dr. Christian Borgsmuller had mentioned that facility is going to be up and running in September. And there is some LNG possible from folks like Panhandle Energy or Sempra LNG, who have DOE approval to sell to non-FTA countries. But one of the things that Dr. Borgsmuller had mentioned, which was interesting, he said that even during the height of the Cold War, gas still flowed through the lines to Western Europe from the Soviet Union. So maybe we're just getting a little paranoid about this, but still in all, there are some possibilities, and I think the LNG boom is going to be, open a whole new regime for the state of Louisiana, and I'm sure you're going to be touching on that to some extent at the luncheon. But that's my presentation.
Thank you, sir. And before we open it up to the floor for Q&A, I'd like to give the opportunity for Ms. Sayers or Dr. Mohammed to respond or rebut any of the comments stated.
I don't have
No?
any comments.
I can speak for an hour, but I'll try to be brief. Maybe just to put a bit more optimism after some of the things we heard. And I start with agriculture and maybe say a few remarks on the European elections. So starting with agriculture, it's 4% of EU-US trade, but indeed I agree, a very difficult and sensitive 4%. And it's true, every senator in this country has an agricultural constituency. We are often reminded of that. And it's true that on the European side, we have to pass the agreement through the European Parliament. Anything related to food safety, consumer protection, consumer information is extremely sensitive in Europe. And any indication that we would somehow trade consumer safety for economic benefits would generate massive problems. But that being said, we still think there is a fine line to walk to resolve some of these issues. So talking about genetically modified organisms, I am less worried about that because the current system that we have right now Cultivation is largely prohibited in most member states in Europe. We have a system where different member states can decide for themselves, because cultivation is the most sensitive part, because it contaminates, if you want, the different fields. It has issues about traceability. So we have a system where certain member states do not allow any cultivation. Others have specific rules about that. But we do allow imports. So you have a system where American exports, and they're very usually used for feed of animals, are being allowed. It's true that it's a long process sometimes, so that we could work on improving the process, making it faster. But by and large, what we hear from industry is that because you have hardly any production in Europe, you have production in the US, you have a way to have some exports allowed. In the end, American companies are beneficial and are able to access the European market under certain conditions. So I think if we can give guarantees on the process and the fact that things are not going to get stuck unnecessarily in Europe, I think there is a way forward to address some of the problems without fundamentally changing our rules, which is not politically sellable in Europe. Consumers have very strong views on that, certainly in certain countries. You have differences of views, but there are certain countries, and I can mention Austria, for instance, where this is politically explosive, I would say. So I think GMOs, there is a sensible way forward. Talking about hormones or ractopamines, the growth enhancers, it's true that there are very, very strong views in Europe about that. The consumers do not want that, so they want grass-fed beef and not corn plus hormone-fed beef. The science, as often is patchy, you will find studies going in both directions. I think, again, what the EU has been indicating very clearly is that we would be able to reduce our tariffs and often very significant market access for non-hormone beef, so grass-fed beef. It's true that part of the industry, as you mentioned, believes that it forces them to reallocate and do their supply chain differently, but you already have grass-fed beef in this country. That's what I buy in Washington. It's more expensive, so you will sell it more expensively in Europe. That's what we've offered to Canada, and they seem to think that it's interesting. Other countries like Brazil and others are certainly supplying Europe with non-hormone beef. So I think there is a substantial market access. I think European consumers will buy it, but again, they will buy it grass-fed. So that's for the industry to look at it. But we have reasons to believe that it's still very interesting commercially if we open a substantial quota for American beef. The issue of geographical indications, it sounds anecdotic. There is a lot of miscommunication about this, and Kraft and the dairy industry is certainly very vocal in Washington, D.C. on this issue. I think, again, it's a question about a few products where we have to agree on what you can use as a name. We've done it on the wine and spirits agreement, so we agreed that you can say California champagne, but not champagne, so it was possible. We've submitted on the European Union side a list of 200 products where we think we have to negotiate what can be done and how it can be labeled and what can be said. Probably 30 of them are more sensitive, mostly on the dairy side. But again, it's not about Parmesan, it's Parmigiano Reggiano that European producers want to protect. It's not Gouda, it's Gouda Holland, where they don't like that you have the word Holland when it's produced in Wisconsin. So again, and there are things that obviously, why use an Italian flag or a Greek flag if it's a product made in the US? So again, it's an issue about people sitting down and trying to agree on very specifics for every product. It is going to be difficult. European member states feel strongly about that. Producers in a lot of countries feel strongly about that. We are also ready to discuss, protection of some of the names on the US side. You also have Idaho potatoes, Vidalia onions, Maine lobsters, and there are things that maybe on the European market are not working well for American products. So So again, it's sensitive. Hopefully, common sense prevails. Also, because again, there's so much to be gained in other areas. But I agree, it's not easy. Historically, we've stumbled across agriculture in the past. So we'll work hard on that. I think maybe one of the reasons why I feel we will succeed, and hopefully more than a modest TTIP, still an ambitious TTIP, is that failure would send a very negative signal across the world. People will celebrate in Moscow, in Beijing, in Brasilia, that the EU and the US again cannot agree on something like that. And I think our leaders are quite aware of that, and hopefully that will be enough to go over some of the difficulties in specific sectors. So I tend to be more of an optimist. You have to be when you're doing trade negotiations also. You have to be optimistic. Maybe just one word on the elections. Clearly, it was, I mean, we had predicted a rise of the extremes. It was probably worse than anticipated. I think the system is still very governable. The way the rules work is that the mainstream parties have to work together in the European Parliament. So they have the majority, the right and the left will have to work together, but we also have a system where maybe unlike the US Congress, things have to move forward. So the system will not get stuck because the parties will find a compromise and they will find a coalition and they will be able to pass legislation without difficulty. What is true is that it means in general, the way we work on the European Union side, we'll have to maybe do things differently, address some of the concerns. I think member states have to be much better about explaining what Brussels is about, what it's not about. So far, we have a communication issue on the way Europe is working. We'll have to address some of the extremist issues. One of the difficulties that often it's a collection of national systems, right? So the reasons why the extremes grew in Greece is because of the crisis, the austerity, so it's a reaction against austerity. In the UK, the extreme is very much a negative sentiment, Eurosceptic sentiment about Europe. In France, it's a lot of disillusion about the current parties and what they've been achieving so far. So you have a mix of negative sentiments, they crystallize and they bring us those extreme groups in the parliament who have very different platforms, so they may not be able to work together to have a very negative agenda. But it's true that on trade, we will have to be very vigilant and make sure that we pay attention to what the European Parliament is sensitive about, that we explain even more. So we cannot be complacent. It's clear that the elections are showed that Europe is maybe not on a good path. We have another election in 5 years, and I think we'll have to do things a bit differently. But in terms of the EU-US relationship, I wouldn't expect too much of a ripple effect. I think it's more for domestic politics and the way we do certain things domestically. I think that's enough.
Thank you, Ms. Sayers.
One question I had, and that's, I'm not sure of everything that you've got on the table, but what about these ridiculous U.S. dumping laws against Italian pasta, butter cookies from Denmark, and of all things, ball bearings from Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom? I thought the 8th Air Force had bombed the Schweinfurt ball bearing plants. Is that something that's going to be on the table? Because it's political, really.
Yeah. Well, you know, the whole issue of trade defense measures, the fact that, you know, on both sides you can have complaints if you think the prices that is being sold on your market is higher than the prices that you have domestically. I mean, you have specific rules on both sides, and it's linked to you have international rules on what you can do and cannot do. Some of it view it as very protectionist in many ways and very old-fashioned way to look at trade. But so far, the decision has been made not to touch that in the context of TTIP. So we feel that there is a system, however imperfect, and neither side was very keen to renegotiate the kind of rules we have right now.
But we still have to get the scientists to agree what hormone is safe and what is not. It reminds me of that movie, The Marathon Man, Laurence Olivier, the Nazi dentist, asking Dustin Hoffman, is it safe? Is it safe?
Would any of the other panelists like to speak before we open up to Q&A?
Just one quick thing on when countries negotiate regulations and standards. And you think about tariffs, which can clearly be negotiated bilaterally. Right? You could reduce tariffs on a particular country and leave tariffs in place on countries not involved in the negotiation. The question is, when you negotiate standards and regulations and you approve certain production practices, so let's say the European Union gives in on certain ways we produce beef, pork, and poultry. The question is, that can't be exclusive to the United States. These new standards and practices then have to be applied to all places that they import from. And so the point is, can the U.S. really benefit exclusively then to get the EU to sort of be more lenient to certain practices when these practices have to be applied worldwide? And so that's one of the difficult issues about regulations and standards, very different from tariffs, where you can talk about bilateral benefits in the case of tariffs. But standards and regulations, it's going to apply the world over once they change.
Any questions?
I have a question now regarding the outcome of the European elections. Where do you contribute this now result that the people, I repeat now, how do you interpret now the results of the European elections in there? Where do you see that now we had gone wrong, or the governments in there, or the international community, the World Trade Center, whoever is involved, because everyone is participating and everyone is bearing a small responsibility for the results that we have now seen recently in Europe. And I would like to just now hear from Professor Hogg in there from Loyola University, because now he seems to just now follow the European now
I follow
outcome of
it
elections,
a
and
lot.
also from Professor Wellenberg. Thank you.
Thank you. I follow it a lot, but I will repeat that I'm not a European in the sense, of course, so many of us are Europeans from our heritage, but Madame Hinder Sayers accurately described the very disorderly array of opposition coming from so many different directions, far left, far right, depending on the country, on the member state. They are generally just anti-X, anti-anything parties, depending on the member state and their particular economic circumstances. The anti-immigration party prevailed in Denmark, and of course in Greece they were responding to the truthfully terrible economic problems that the people in Greece have gone through. In the United Kingdom, it's different. Germany elected pretty much a neo-Nazi to the European Parliament, and for the first time has several members of the Alternative for Germany, AfD party, that are very anti-Euro. So you want to help me on this? I mean, there are just so many different angles of no, of we're not happy, and they all came together in this election, and the majority, of course, is still solidly in the center-right and center-left grand coalition together. But my fear is that everyone now is very cautious about antagonizing all of these diverse negative influences.
It's
It's awful.
to be optimistic, but finally, there was one way in which the elections surprised us in a good way, which was turnout was actually higher than in 2009. I believe it was about 43%, which for a European election is awful, but for us would be the best turnout we've ever had for a midterm election. I don't think it's anything new. It's been coming for a long time. It's been going down each time. It's for those students in here, if you want some background on some of this stuff, just Google anything Margaret Thatcher ever said to Jacques Delors. Google that, and you'll get all of your answers about what they do like and don't like. Eurosceptic parties in Britain are not news. Eurosceptic parties in some of these other places maybe are, but it's nothing new. It's the lack of the major argument that I think holds some weight is the lack of democratic accountability. If Senator Landrieu does something that we really don't like, and I know she would never do that, we can vote her out of office. if Italian consumers do not like their new beef, they really have no recourse. They could punish their prime minister, but the prime minister doesn't make those decisions. It's made in Brussels, so it's an anti-Brussels vote. It's been coming for a long time, and they've got 5 years now. All the major parties did lose, but they're still there. So whatever they can pull together in the next 5 years, it's probably going to be their last chance. So I think it's less what happened this time than what they do in this relatively lame duck session that they may or may not have.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Caitlin Kane. I'm the advocate with the U.S. Small Business Administration Office of Advocacy. And my question is less so on the political side, more so related to process. Particularly, how are small businesses being treated in the process? As I travel throughout Region 6, I hear a lot about access to opportunity, access to contracts, procurement opportunities. And is that also being brought into the dialogue that you're having? And can you just talk a little bit about the perspective of the small business community?
Anyone?
Yes, it's an interesting topic. It's a topic that both sides have started to look at a bit more. Traditionally, it's true that the way trade associations are organized on both sides, they tend to give a more prominent voice to big businesses, and they tend to be more involved and follow more closely the negotiations. We've just published, actually, during the fourth round, the EU and the US published a small report with concrete examples about how small and business-sized companies on both sides could benefit. And we think that, when it comes to customs and trade facilitation procedures, that can be very onerous for a small company that's shipping on both sides. When it comes to the regulatory differences, where it's much easier for a large chemical company to comply with different set of rules than for a small producer that has maybe just one product. So we think there are actually very significant benefits for small businesses, even though we may not have spelled it out, and even though many of them may not be aware of that process so far. So I know a number of companies, notably the express delivery companies that work a lot with small businesses, are collecting examples and issues that could be addressed more efficiently. We have a think tank in Washington that's also looking at that issue to try to spell out some of the problems and the things that should be looked at. I know in the US you had, I think, a comprehensive survey trying to go in different states and ask small and business-sized companies what they would like to address for this agreement. So I think there is definitely an awareness that this is an issue, that we should do more to reach out to small businesses and get their input. And again, we have a lot of concrete examples about how it could make a difference for a company that is trying to trade and that's already trading on both sides. So really, it's an area that has attracted the attention of politicians. I mean, I think what is clear is that also on both sides, most jobs are created by small businesses. So we're very aware of that also.
Ms. Hinderer, I'm curious about your name. You're a facilitator, but in English, a hinderer is someone quite different. No, I had noticed that on the conclusion of the last fifth round of negotiations, you did have a town hall meeting to bring in people to voice their gripes, bitches, that sort of thing. How did that work out?
It's something that the US has been doing, as you say, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations for a while. And it's something new for the European Union. I mean, we have, if you want, these kind of town hall meetings, but independently from negotiations. We do that in Brussels, where we gather stakeholders, we explain, we seek their input. So it's something we're now experiencing on the US negotiation side, that during each round, we have one afternoon or one day that's devoted to different stakeholders coming, making presentations, explaining their views. I mean, you do get people who are skeptical about trade, but you also get some small businesses that come sometimes and express their issue. We have companies that also explain their views on different issues. And I think it's been actually an interesting process. I mean, you do get some negativity, but you also get, good new ideas and a good interaction. And in those meetings, people are able to directly interact with the lead negotiators. So somebody interested in energy can go directly to the EU and US leads on energy and discuss very technical issues and their specific problems. So I don't think it's the be-all and end-all, and there's many other things we have to do to consult people and seek their input, but it's been working relatively well so far, and I think it will continue because there's a lot of demand for people to be involved.
Caitlin, let me ask you, is your experience that there is a solid level of communication about what's going on with TTIP? One of the reasons that I think being on the ground and listening to concerns about people that represent small businesses is that it is getting to folks like you. I think when you're in Washington and you're in the bubble and you don't have the opportunity to hear what's going on the ground. Senator Landrieu, of course, was recently the chairman of the Small Business Committee in the Senate and left that committee assignment to go to the Energy Committee. So as we think about small business issues, we wouldn't want to find out that after the deal has been done that people are saying, what happened? Why weren't we a part of the process? And so as we keep and maintain a line of communication, I'd like to hear from you if there are ways that we can improve that line of communication, because we're communicating with USTR, and if there are ways to expand those opportunities, we'd like to do that.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that, and I think the relationships are definitely getting much more pronounced. So I think as we continue to move forward, just talking even offline about ways in which we can collaborate, and I can provide you information that I'm hearing from Region 6 and vice versa, I think that would be very powerful.
Okay. Any more questions?
I have two questions if we have time, but from a negotiating perspective, how large a role does the lack of the President's Trade Promotion Authority play in TTIP and obviously in TPP as well?
Well, if you put an agreement forward without Trade Promotion Authority, then you give individual senators and congressmen the right to nitpick at certain things that are important to them. And you end up then with sort of individual exclusions, and let's say we all had these individual exclusions, and then you have no agreement, right? And so one of the things that Trade Promotion Authority allows is for the Congress to just do an up or down vote on a proposed agreement. And so without it, there's no real reason for countries to move forward. And so, I mean, whether or not, I mean, all presidents have had some issue with Trade Promotion Authority in the past, just in terms of sort of the politics behind it. So I've never been personally concerned about it, that when they say, let's wait until November, I just assume it's some political issues that they're dealing with in their districts that sort of force them to not necessarily want to look so favorable to the president in these negotiations. But that said, without it, I can't see a viable agreement moving forward when an individual congressman or senator solely concerned about a district or a state is going to have input in the whole process based on his own interests and rational self-interest only related to that state. You know. But it has happened. I mean, we've gotten sugar excluded from agreements based solely on sort of the politics of this state and this state alone. And so even with Trade Promotion Authority, it could take place. But that said, I mean, it's a fundamental thing that we need in place in order for these agreements to move forward.
If I may comment, I think that the TPA is critical. The problem is that there is a certain political environment as it relates to the trade agreements. And in fact, there is a queue, as we would describe the queue. There are some potential differences of opinion about the queue, but certainly at this point there have been 20 negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There have been 5 negotiations on TTIP, and TPA is sitting out there waiting to be voted on. And to one of the big issues, and as you talk about it, Dr. Mohammed, the fact that a TPA is so critical, the reason is that it's an unamendable bill, and you know, if you are able to get parochial interests involved, we would never get trade deals done ever. But we were recently in a meeting with a very large multinational company and talking about the TTIP negotiations, and it was a European company. And they believe, because of the huge economic impact that potentially TTIP will have on the European-American trading relationship, that they should catapult ahead of TPP. There was some discussion about that. I was surprised to have heard that. But in fact, there are people thinking that because of the economic impacts, that there is a case to be made for an acceleration of TTIP negotiations. I think that would be very difficult, but there are people that are in fact thinking about that. So TPA is very important. I think that the elections have somewhat frozen any sort of ability to move forward at this moment, but we are optimistic and want to remain optimistic. Certainly pro-free trade members of Congress are important to propel these agreements forward, so we don't want to inject too much cynicism in the process.
Anyone else? No? And you had one more question,
Yeah, I had
Ms. Sapp?
one more, and this is, I guess, for Mr. Tyner. But from an energy perspective, with everything going on in Russia and the Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, has there been any talk, I guess, within D.C. of opening up energy exports to non-FTA countries who are, our allies?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. All of those things are on the table at this very moment. And in fact, we were talking about Lithuania earlier, and the Lithuanian energy minister participated in a hearing that Senator Landrieu convened a couple of months ago on this very question. And the panel, who were experts in their fields, talking about gas prices and the global marketplace and non-free trade agreement countries where we could potentially export energy resources too, and that is a very hot topic. In Louisiana, part of the discussion is that when you open up the LNG question, for example, we want to mention both the natural gas side of things, LNG, and also crude oil. The fact that we have not been able to export have been impacted by what happened 30 years ago. And so at that moment, nobody had foreseen that we would be having this energy revolution at the moment. And so now that we have to examine all of those opportunities. And as we are not importing as much energy anymore, what are we going to do with this overabundance of supply? So that supply is a huge question, and some of the refiners in the United States, certainly here we have tremendous commercial partners that are in the petrochemical industry that have concerns from a refining standpoint. So those are concerns that we are all taking into consideration, and as it relates to TTIP, we want to make sure that the environmental standards are appropriate, and so those questions we're working through. But as it relates to non-FTA countries, it's absolutely on the table. It's a discussion that's having a big momentum at the moment.
I think we have time for one more question.
What would a modest agreement look like for Louisiana? What sectors would be affected most by a trade agreement like this? I'm not for anyone, I guess.
Dr. Weinberg?
Obviously, the refining is going to be a big deal petroleum-wise. Agriculture, pretty much all of the sticking points, all of the sticky products are ones that are grown here. Fish, sugar, poultry, beef, the new grain thing. I don't know how grain works. Once it gets out of the ground. The new grain thing that he's got going is only going to work if we're exporting grain, and that's so if grain is decided to be safe, if it's genetically modified. We will still sell it to other places, but I think the biggest benefit for Louisiana just comes in the port. Any trade-offs, any losses by any individual sector here are going to be offset by the activity that goes on down here. I can't imagine it being a different way. So I think that's what sells it to Louisiana, just having the biggest port in the country.
Any projections on what an increase in exports or imports would look like at the Port of New Orleans, for instance?
Well, I can't give actual numbers because these are preliminary results, and obviously anything you say representing USDA could be sort of taken as something official. But at least the researchers in my branch, they did a preliminary run, just mainly looking at market access issues, so reducing tariffs down to zero, just as sort of a best case scenario. Now, mind you, when we're talking about agricultural trade, you can almost guess based on the trajectory of trade in the past couple of years what actually happened. And the result is as you reduce those tariffs, you see a narrowing of the trade balance. So you get huge gains in agricultural exports to a certain degree from the United States relative to the EU, but you do see increased gains for the EU as well, just not as large. And that's across most sectors. And then you see certain sectors where you really see gains where, like dairy trade between the two countries, that we'd export a lot more whey products and import a lot more cheese from the European Union. And that's based on the fact that tariffs are relatively high in the dairy sector between the two countries. And so that's it. Like I said, I can't give particular numbers about that. But I mean, and that's only market access. Now, when you throw in the whole issue of sort of coming to some agreement on regulations and standards, you may see an even larger increase, particularly when you think about, I think we've already come to some agreement on if the U.S. No longer use ractopamine, there's some other alternative for increasing lean muscle mass in animals that could be approved in the EU, not approved now, but could eventually be approved. And so you do still have some of the regulatory issues that could lead to increased trade.
How much of that is going through Louisiana, of course?
Well, I would assume quite a bit of the grain exports go down the Mississippi River from the Corn Belt region.
60%.
And so, okay, so 60% of is what. So, I mean, quite a bit of it is going to be impacted through the Port of Louisiana and Port of New Orleans rather than the ports down the Mississippi River.
And I just want to, if anyone wants to make any closing statements?
Well, I'll be optimistic. The only closing things I'd like to, I guess, remind everybody, first of all, that it's not all cheating. It's not all trying to, take advantage of the other side, but there's an awful lot of that. Consumers do have very different concerns about what's safe. They've had some very major scares over there with mad cow and things like that, they're warranted to do that. But in regard to tariffs and really any of these economic things, geographical indications, phytosanitary measures, these are all what cynics, or maybe economists, would call non-tariff barriers to trade. Tariffs aren't a problem. We can get rid of those anytime. What they've been doing for a long time is, they tell the Parmesan cheese maker, we used to have a tariff, they said we couldn't have tariffs anymore. So we'll give you an export subsidy instead. And then they said, we can't do that anymore. All right, well now we'll say that no one can sell Parmesan cheese because it's your intellectual property. We're running out of things that we can do here. So the economic impact of those are just as real. We could have no tariffs on sugar, but some qualitative restriction on sugar. And then the final thing I would say, from an international standpoint, someone mentioned that it would send a bad signal to the world if we couldn't get this together. And that may be. I think it might also send a scary one if we do get this together. This is a Target merging with Walmart type of scenario for Brazil, Argentina, Russia, the Ukraine, especially developing countries. So if we can work out our differences, this is going to be a very big deal for the other 193 countries. Well, I'm subtracting 28. I can't do the math.
Anyone else?
I would just say that to remind everyone that this is a process. It is full of negotiating that is done at a very high level, and a lot of work goes into these trade agreements. And I want to say to Adeline that we appreciate what you're doing. We appreciate the USTR's trade negotiators that are working in behalf of the United States. The USTR trade team is a relatively small team. The USTR is a relatively small agency. And so when you have a group of people that are working very diligently with generally not a lot of praise as they go through the process. When they arrive in places like Germany or Brussels or Washington, they're not generally met with rose petals and champagne, or a beat of beer for that matter. But
Sparkling wine.
but we greatly appreciate what both the EU and the American trade negotiators are doing in the various sectors, and appreciate it very much.
All right, well, I'd like to thank all our panelists for coming. We really appreciate it, guys. And before we take a little break for lunch, I'd like to invite up our CEO, Mr. Knoll, say a few words.
Yeah, I would like to say thank you, everyone, and I would just say again, like Mark was saying, we would like to thank everyone for being here, not just being here representative of the EU, but also during her birthday, and so we have a little present.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Cut it later, but for all of you, we will go into breaks. We're going to have a 15-minute break, and then please let's reconvene for lunch, where we'll hear very exciting things about more energy-related things from Mark. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, you too.
Thank you very much, guys. It was a
pleasure.
Good luck.
I give you more.
Thank you, Professor. It's so nice. Oh, absolutely.